It's Friday, July 5th in the year of our Lord 2024. Natalie G. Winters here hosting in the War Room. I hope you guys had a lovely 4th of July. I know it's the paradox of patriotism in this country, right? And I know our next guest has talked about that extensively, how those of us who love the country so much are the most hated and, frankly, as Stephen K. Bannon would be proud to hear, feared by the regime. It's why they have to silence us. We got Darren J. Beattie joining us, or should I say Dr. Darren J. Beattie, to walk us through what is, you call it a civil war, I don't know what you want to chalk it up to, but what is going on with Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the Democrats right now. It seems like they're in meltdown. But before we get into your kind of predictions on what you think the future of that ticket is, what you think Joe Biden is going to do, is he going to step down? I'm just curious, obviously you lead Revolver News. You have a very good eye on sort of the timing of the news cycle. And here in the War Room, we always say it's about pattern recognition. What do you think was sort of the impetus behind this news cycle to begin with? In other words, why have the floodgates opened? Why has as Politico said, the dam broke on Joe Biden now?
There's a lot of interesting things going on. And first of all, I'm interested to know that your middle initial is G. And I suppose you've earned the middle initial now that you are in a same position as a host, sitting in for our friend Steve, given that he's not available at the moment. So I congratulate you.
He's on assignment, as Steve would say.
He's on assignment, right. So congratulations. Very, very great to be with you here in this context, although lamentable that Steve is out under these conditions. But you're right. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. We see speculation about Biden stepping down. We see a rare thing, actually a very instructive and rare thing, that the usually Democrat-aligned media is now in a position of active hostility to Biden. So we need to kind of interpret that. And then most recently, you see a lot of speculation about Kamala. So let's kind of go over it one or another. For people who've been following Revolver.news, we're kind of known for bucking the trends, going against conventional wisdom, including conventional wisdom on the right. And we've always maintained that Biden is probably going to stay, even now. That sounds shocking to some people, but if you want to understand the reasons, you can read the full piece at revolver.news. But basically, to get rid of Biden this late in the game would be utterly disastrous, even more so than keeping him in. So unless Biden is really in a condition of like a vegetative state, and even then, they probably won't get rid of him. And the smarter strategists understand this. You saw David Axelrod come out and said, in an exasperated tone, look, guys, the time to have had this conversation about Biden was a year ago, not now. And this gets to the media's role. Why didn't they have this conversation a year ago? Part of the reason was that the Democrats were very successful in the midterms. And so if they had done poorly in the midterms, I think that conversation may have happened or would have been more likely. The Democrats did well in the midterms, which ironically ended up helping them be in this unenviable position now for 2024. But also the media was gaslighting super hard in relation to Biden's health. And so perhaps unwittingly, inadvertently, the media ended up screwing up the Democrats this time because they played into this false narrative that, any speculation about Biden's health is just right-wing conspiracy stuff. So the media gaslit. People talk about dictators gassing their own people. In this case, the media gaslit their own people. The media gaslit the Democrats. And there's nobody more susceptible to mainstream media lies than elite liberals, elite Democrats. They actually believe this stuff, and the media facilitated these delusions. And that was compounded by the fact that a lot of the people who would have been in a position to help remove Biden or to influence him to go, their own political careers and prospects were closely intertwined with the future of Biden. So you're asking people to go against their own immediate political interests, which is inconceivable for people in the political world, especially people in senior Democratic positions in the Biden's inner circle. So that's basically the situation that got them to this position today. And that's how I interpret the media's very interesting attack role against the Democrat position, against the senior Democrat position, is it's a cover your ass kind of insurance thing, because the media realizes its own complicity in putting the Democrats in this unfortunate position. So they're backtracking hard by saying, okay, we're calling for Biden to step down, to kind of make up for the fact that they irresponsibly gaslit the Democrats regarding Biden's health. Nonetheless, I still think Biden's going to stay. Part of the reason for that is all the movers and shakers despise Kamala Harris. They know she would be a train wreck. They know she would be horrible. And that's kind of a twist to how I would interpret some of this talk about Kamala as of the past week or so. There's an angle to say, okay, look, these people are getting ready to, I hate to use the word groom, but to groom Kamala for a role in the presidency. But another way to look at it is, if the position is Kamala is a non-starter, to have senior Black Democrats come out and say, there's no way you're going to overstep Kamala. If there are any puppeteers within the Democrat machine thinking that they can engineer some kind of coup that circumnavigates the Kamala problem, you better think again, because there's going to be hell to pay. You're not stepping over Kamala. You're not going to leapfrog Kamala. And by making that very clear, that actually puts Kamala in a position as an insurance policy. Because anyone who would have been attracted to this idea of getting rid of Biden, maybe putting someone like a Newsom or a Whitmer or whomever in their kind of deranged fantasy world, that's not going to happen. And so I almost think that the talk about Kamala and Kamala flexing has the effect of almost reinforcing and reaffirming Biden's position, which he's stated publicly very recently that he's not going anywhere. So against the conventional wisdom, I think Biden's going to stay.
Well, and it's not even just the mainstream media. I mean, you can see the old clips of Kamala and other high-level Biden, regime officials kind of echoing these talking points. Anthony Fauci was talking with Andrew Mitchell just last week saying, oh, Biden was really lucid and well-informed and giving, introspective and insightful comments during discussions about the pandemic. And I think it's such an interesting juxtaposition to draw with that of President Trump, right? Because what was it? Every single day of his administration, you had some other individual, whether it was a high-ranking member of his actual cabinet, people in the media kind of coming out and daring to criticize him, not for any, mental deficits or shortages like that, just for daring to put America first. Meanwhile, mum's the word with everyone when it comes to Joe Biden. But I'm curious, I think we would agree with you, though. I think there probably is still a part of Steve that thinks Michelle Obama is going to be coming out of the wings to sort of, I would say, neuter any criticism of putting someone like Gavin Newsom in there, right? Because at least you still have, as they would say euphemistically, a woman of color, even if it's not Kamala. But I'm just curious, it's very rare that you see a lack of a united front, right? Such a kind of disarray, I think, at least within Democrats when it comes to something as significant as, the 2024 election and all of the attacks that they are now hurling against President Biden. If he doesn't drop out, I think it's fair to say that those will be clipped and shared and used by the Trump campaign, right? They're sort of damaging their own candidate. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, what you think the calculus is there to even try to have him step out under the kind of guidelines of what David Axelrod is saying, right? We should have done this a year ago. Why even try to take shots at him if they don't think there's a real choice?
Right. Well, I think it's chaos emerging from mixed messaging. And really, a lot of people were caught flat-footed by the debate. I mean, this is something that's hard for us to digest, in particular, the unusually informed audience here at the War Room, is that Democrats, even Democrat elites, in some cases, especially Democrat elites, are uniquely susceptible to mainstream media propaganda. And I think a lot of people really were caught flat-footed, not in relation to Biden's, everyone knows Biden slowed down, he's older, but up until this point, there was the impression that they could kind of cover that up, paper it over. As recently as the State of the Union, Biden actually did very well relative to expectations. I was surprised how well he did. And people, I think, were underestimated how different it would be just a few months later and under different conditions where he's not reading from a teleprompter. So you kind of got the raw and unedited version of what Biden can really be like. And that was shocking to people. And they got off message. They freaked out. And again, like I said, there's this dimension of the media is very culpable for putting Biden in this position precisely because they gaslit on the issue of Biden's health. They're between the media's gaslighting and the Democrats' successful midterm performance. Those are the two critical factors that prevented this conversation from happening a year ago when there was still time and runway to get rid of Biden without disastrous results. And so I think a lot of people are just not, it was a shock. And so they weren't on message. And now you have the media trying to cover their ass. And you're again in this very interesting position where for once the media is kind of in an open position of tension, if not outright conflict with the Democrat senior strategist. It's hard to see where all this is going to go. I suspect that over the coming weeks, you're going to see a kind of a walk back, a smoothing over. The media is ultimately going to resign itself to the reality that, yeah, they're in a horrible position now with somebody like Biden, but it's an absolute disaster if they try to get rid of him this late in the game. I think they'll all eventually get on message there, but not without considerable damage. As you say, it's a big deal if the New York Times editorial board calls for the Democrat, presumptive nominee to step down. But the media is a good consensus machine. And in this case, I think they'll just fall in line and paper things over. And now they have the insurance of saying, hey, we called for Biden to step down. We're not at fault anymore, erasing their complicity for over a year in covering this up.
No, you're so right. And I think a story that really encapsulates this, I'm sure the War Room Posse is already up to date on it, but Olivia Nuzzi for New York Magazine, they published the story, what was it, yesterday, talking about how when she met Joe Biden, she was like, his hands were cold, right? He was like 40% dead. They were debating what percent, deathly he looked. And it was a shared concern among donors and activists and, people in the White House. But the best part of the story, the buried lead, is the reporting is from back in January, right? And the question is, well, why didn't you publish the story then? Made even better, there's now a chorus of left-wing journalists who are defending Joe Biden, criticizing her for using anonymous sources, to which she then defends herself by saying, I never saw you guys criticize me for using anonymous sources against President Trump, right? It's a good double standard, I think, to compare how they treated Trump, right, versus Biden, especially on this front. But, to take a step back, because obviously we want to stay ahead of the curve here in the War Room, it's not just about Joe Biden, make no mistake, we're obviously focusing on that. But I think that this really, begs the question that if they're lying to you, to your face, right, so blatantly about something that is so critical, that is the mental health of the commander-in-chief, Joe Biden, I think it sort of proves that they're lying to us about everything else. And I know that's not a hot take here in the War Room, but you're someone who really has led the curve, or really been the tip of the spear, I think, been ahead of the curve rather, on January 6th reporting, of course, a host of other issues. But when you see this kind of mainstream media news cycle unfolding, how do you interpret this for all of the other kind of lies that we've been told, particularly in your expertise, your case, the January 6th stuff?
That's an excellent question. And actually, it's an excellent transition to what I was intending to say is something really critical about Kamala Harris. For those who've been following our reporting, in particular on the pipe bomb, the January 6th pipe bomb, one of the most glaring and damning questions of all of the Fedsurrection is, why does Kamala Harris, the most politically opportunistic creature around, against all seeming political interest, refused to milk the fact that she was in the DNC building when the pipe bomb was right outside the building, as the pipe bomb was discovered, and as the pipe bomb was removed? Think of how instrumental the January 6th narrative is to the Democrat strategy. It was a key part of their criminal case against Trump, which thankfully the Supreme Court just took a big dump on, which is great. But still, it's done a lot of damage. In fact, indirectly, it's the reason that Steve isn't around right now. The January 6th lie, they've gotten so much out of it and they banked so much on it. And the lie is that this is one of the worst domestic terror acts, and it was committed by Trump supporters and Trump himself as a person who incited, according to them. Now, they've gone to great lengths to reinforce this narrative. They've lied endlessly. Just to take one example, they lied about an officer, Capitol Police Officer Sicknick, saying he was bludgeoned to death by the MAGA mob. Revolver years ago proved that this wasn't true, and the New York Times corrected it accordingly. But there's one thing that they don't have to lie about. But Kamala Harris, the woman of color vice president-elect, was within feet of the January 6th pipe bomb. So why isn't that their number one talking point about January 6th? That Kamala Harris herself came within a hair's width of losing her life to the MAGA pipe bomb. Why would Joe Biden, who took the enormous step, and now we know how infirm he is, he took the occasion of January 6th anniversary to give over an hour-long speech. That's how important this is to them. And yet in that entire hour, he did not mention that his vice president came within a hair's width of the MAGA pipe bomb, as they would call it. Why? Why are they covering this up? In fact, Kamala Harris has not to this day even acknowledged her presence in the DNC. Why is what would ordinarily be the number one Democrat talking point about January 6th the most carefully guarded secret of January 6th? Why won't Kamala Harris mention it? And to deepen our suspicions in this regard, remember that amazing piece of surveillance footage brought to the public courtesy of Thomas Massey's tireless efforts working on buttressing our reporting at Revolver News by getting some footage released. Remember the piece of footage showing the discovery of the DNC pipe bomb at the DNC, that clearly both the Capitol Police and the Secret Service protecting Kamala's own Secret Service detail. It's absolutely clear from that footage that they knew that the bomb was fake. How can I conclude that? Well, they let a group of school children walk right by the bomb. They stood right by it like it was nothing. And then just minutes later, they go through the public charade of having a bomb-safe robot dismantle it, when just minutes earlier, they let a group of kids walk by the bomb. They clearly knew it was fake. How did they know it was fake? And that's a very interesting fact when we connect it with Kamala Harris's inexplicable silence on the issue. Again, this is totally in line with her political interests. They're trying to build January 6th to be a domestic terror event. Why isn't Kamala in every conversation about January 6th saying, folks, I almost lost my life to these MAGA terrorists. I was in this building when the pipe bomb was discovered. What is so damning to their narrative that it's worth it for Kamala to forego being able to milk those talking points? What are they hiding? What is Kamala Harris hiding? This is a very dark question that we've drawn attention to. And now with the speculation surrounding Kamala, I think we need to ask it with renewed vigor and renewed focus. They're counting on us to forget it. It's incumbent on us to just stay at it until Kamala Harris is forced to answer this question. Because yes, January 6th happened over 3 years ago, but people need to understand January 6th remains a key part of the Democrats' failing strategy to win in 2024. It's time for the whole house of cards to fall. And believe it or not, Kamala Harris seems to be at the center of it.
Darren, thank you for all the work you do defending our democracy. I use that word lightly. But Darren, if people want to follow you, stay up to date with everything you're working on, Revolver News, all of it, where can they go to do all that?
We're in the cutting edge of all the latest developments, revolver.news, big piece on Kamala coming up. And we're, of course, at the leading edge of strategy and analysis when it comes to everything related to the election and everything political. So go to revolver.news, share it with your friends. I'm on Twitter, or I guess X, at Darren J. Beattie, and we are very proudly on Getter at Revolver News.
It's where all his hot takes are. You got to follow him on Getter. Darren, thank you so much for joining us. You have a nice weekend.
You too, Natalie. Thank you.
You know, it was President Trump who I think opened up, right, really the very imperative discourse that is the media is lying to you, right? Fake news, he coined that term. And I think with what we're seeing now, we can't let this slip. As Steve said, we need to make the Democrats own their cover-up of Joe Biden, not for political ramifications, but for the national security implications of this country. And I think it proves, even when you take more of a step back and you look at, I think, how they've been lying to us on just a litany of issues, right? Not just about the mental health of Joe Biden. If you go through the Biden campaign Twitter accounts, the Biden campaign, or Biden's actual POTUS Twitter account, one of the most common attacks that they hurl against President Trump is that he is, quote, weak and feeble. That is their go-to criticism of him. And I think it just proves, again, not that the War Room Posse is a hot take to anyone, right? But the projection is and always has been their guiding strategy, right? Their North Star. And I think when you see them accusing people like Steve Bannon, Project 2025, President Trump, of coming for democracy, right? That we need to defend our democracy from these evil autocrats, people like Stephen K. Bannon. Meanwhile, they're the ones throwing us in jail, or they melt down when we say we're going to come after the mainstream media. Meanwhile, what is it? They've thrown Steve Bannon in jail. They deplatformed Tucker. They've come after Epic Times. They're trying to, bankrupt Gateway Pundit on top of years of censorship and blacklisting advertisement campaigns. It really proves, I think, the projection has been their guiding North Star. And we have a story up on warroom.org that we'll get into after the break. I see we have Libby Emmons up. Libby, we got a few minutes before we go to break, so I will come to you now. The Covenant shooting, the War Room Posse is obviously well-versed in, a transgender lunatic losing their mind down in Tennessee. It was last night, I believe, at 11:58 p.m. on the 4th of July. How's that for really burying the lead? Right? That the judge, I want to get the name, is it Lashia Miles? I think I'm correct, something like that. Ruled that the manifesto of the trans terrorists, let's call it he, she, they, whatever they want to use, what it is, will not ever be released. Can you walk us through this developing story?
Yeah, so Judge Miles, who's a chancery judge in Tennessee, determined that the documents left behind by the trans school shooter Audrey Hale would not be released. She cited copyright, which has been awarded to the parents and families of the victims who were killed. But it is really quite a shocking development. We've had also Michael Patrick Leahy of the Tennessee Star has been trying to get access to those documents. He had some 80 pages leaked of those documents and was facing contempt charges for not revealing who his source was. And the concerns, apparently, per this judge, are that there could be copyright killings due to the release, that other people could make similar plans based on the documents that Hale left behind. But we do know from the release from the Tennessee Star that Hale had been following the Columbine shooters, had sort of celebrated them, was very fascinated by what they had done, that Hale had been in therapy with a mental health professional who did not reveal to authorities that Hale had ideations of killing her family and killing children and killing others. We know that Hale was very confused about gender, thought of herself as a man, decided at a certain point that gender change is possible and began to embark on something along those lines. The pronouns were very confusing. And we also know that shortly after this tragic massacre took place, we had the White House coming out and advocating for trans rights, as though immediately the first thing to do if a trans person goes on a mass murder spree is to say, hey, it's not all trans people, right? Like this is the thing that they do. But yeah, the judge released it late last night, determined that due to copyright claims, this should not be released. Also made comments about how in our current information age, we are too used to having documents released or having information come to us as soon as we request it, and seemed sort of opposed to that. It's also worth noting that Miles' social media, which Judge Miles is very active on social media, is full of glamour shots of Miles at various events or delivering speeches at fifth grade commencement ceremonies, very interested in her own eyeshadow. So just a little background into who this judge might be personally.
Just curious, are there any efforts to appeal this decision, or coming from Michael Patrick Leahy, where do we stand on getting the manifesto?
Well, Leahy did have 80 pages released. Stephen Crowder got his hands on some documents at a certain point as well. And I'm not sure if there's going to be an appeal. I'm sure that Leahy will be vocal about that. He's been publishing a lot about this and has been really quite on top of it. So I think this is a stay tuned scenario.
Libby, I want to hold you through the break because I think we need to draw what is, again, another very important juxtaposition. I swear anytime there's a shooter, even if they're a self-declared, Bernie Sanders supporter, there'll be a mention of Trump in the manifesto, and they somehow, within an hour of the event happening, seem to leak the entire manifesto. The mainstream media is already quoting it, whipping up some narrative, using it, right, to create a false pretense, a false pretext to crack down on whether it's Christians, whether it's, the Trump movement, the MAGA movement. And I think that this shows you, much like what we were talking about with Darren J. Beattie, that it is and always has been the media, right, that they are complicit in so much of this. We'll be right back after the break with Libby Emmons, Jeffrey Tucker, walking through even more lies that the media is spinning on inflation and the economy.
All this nonsense, all this spin, they can't handle the truth.
War Room Battleground with Stephen K. Bannon.
You're back in the War Room. We're still joined by Libby Emmons of the Post Millennial. You're the editor-in-chief there. I also feel like, aren't you with Human Events? You're everywhere. We can't keep you down. You're a busy lady.
Both outlets. Yeah, I work with both outlets.
There you go. Human Events is where I got my starts for my first article that I ever published. I think it was, funnily enough, it was called The Left's Weaponization of Journalism, which is a very fitting title, I think, probably for the show. Maybe that's what we'll call this episode. But Libby, before I let you go, am I wrong in what I was saying before we went to break? I feel like you have good command of the news cycle. I mean, I'm not crazy. If this were the other side of the coin, right, if this were an anti-trans shooting, the manifesto would probably be, printed on T-shirts outside the DNC.
Yeah, sure. They would have renamed July 4th to Trans Rights Day or something like that, just like they're doing with so many of the other days. That is really a compunction of the left, of media. And I do think media is in many ways complicit in this. I think that their desire to spin a narrative that paints conservatives badly, that paints MAGA and Trump badly, and any supporters of that movement badly is really rampant. And we see it all the time. We saw it right in 2016. As soon as Trump won the election, the calls to resist were so loud. And at the time, I wasn't even really involved in journalism. I wasn't really following politics that much. But my first thought was, resist what? What are you trying to resist? Let's look at the policies. Let's support the president. Let's support the country. Let's see what's really going to happen here. And that is not something that leftist media is capable of doing. And as we know, leftist media is pretty much all media. There are few exceptions. There's War Room. There's the Post Millennial. There's Human Events. There's some other outlets that are really great and doing good work. There's, Michael Patrick Leahy at the Tennessee Star, who's really been hammering this thing home with Audrey Hale. But it really behooves all of us to pay attention to the lies that we're being told, to think critically about them, to use our own common sense and understanding, and to not just believe what is forced down our throats every day. It's so easy to be blind to the lies and to just believe what you're told because it's everywhere. It's the water that we swim in. It's entertainment, academia, media, politics, all of it. But it's so important to hold tight to your own values and to know what they are and to know what it is that you believe in and what you're fighting for, because our country really depends on it. Our country depends on those of us who are still thinking clearly and are not blinded to, the truth and reality, literally reality, right? I mean, Audrey Hale was blinded to reality. Audrey Hale thought that perhaps she could be a man. And we know that that's absolutely a complete and total fabrication, worse than any fairy tale that's ever been, sent out there.
No, it's next man up, just like Steve says, although maybe we should add the caveat next biological man and biological woman up. Maybe that's the 2024 rendition that we need. Libby, if people want to follow you, read your work, stay up to date with all of your hot takes on Twitter, on X, where can they go to do that?
I'm at Libby Emmons on Twitter, and you can see all the great work we're doing every day at thepostmillennial.com and humanevents.com.
Libby, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Our next guest, the one and only Jeffrey Tucker, president of the fantastic Brownstone Institute. We got a cold open for you. I want to play this to get your very interesting thoughts. We usually have you on to talk pandemic and COVID stuff, but I guess they're spinning similar lies when it comes to the economy. Consider me shocked. Denver, we can roll it.
June jobs report. Non-farm payrolls expands 206,000. And that, of course, is benchmarked against the rearview mirror, which right now is going to be revised. Minus 111,000 is the 2-month revision. And if we look at the unemployment rate, he nailed it. Our buddy nailed it up 0.1% from 4% to 4.1%. 4.1% is the hottest, and we have to go back a ways. Last time we were at 4.1 was November of 21. So you have to go back now to October of 21 to find a higher rate, which was 4.5.
74% of the jobs came from government and healthcare and education. So that's where the bulk of the jobs are.
Okay.
The rest of the jobs not doing quite so well. Leisure and hospitality, which had been a big source of job growth, just 7,000. Retail, we'd had some strength there, down 8,500. And then temporary help, which is a potential leading sign, minus 48,000. So you have this kind of dual sector economy. By the way, it's not the federal government. A lot of it is local government jobs. They seem to be still hiring in those places or those municipalities. And it's the hospitals up 22,000. So that's where a lot of the job growth is coming from.
Bidenomics not doing too hot, but I guess we don't really even know how to actually adjudicate Bidenomics, since a lot of this data is just so skewed, and it just seems like they're picking it from metrics that don't really affect the American people. Jeffrey Tucker joins us now. Now, you have some great reporting. You have a nice long form piece up in the Brownstone on their website, but also for the Epic Times. I'd love for you to just kind of walk us through your take on this whole inflation narrative and how it's actually tenfold, if not 100, 1,000-fold worse than what we're actually being told.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you want to focus on here. I mean, we could talk about the jobs data, which is all utterly ridiculous. I'm getting so tired of reporting that every month they come up with this jobs data. It's always the same thing. It's part-time jobs going to non-native born workers and losing full-time jobs, and then revisions of this month's increase, of last month's increase, it could be being lost jobs. We're losing full-time workers, gaining part-time workers, and there's a huge differential between the so-called establishment survey and the household survey, which just proves that the establishment survey is double and triple counting. I mean, and you can know all this just by looking at the data. It gets exhausting. Every month it comes out and you just drill down a couple of little spaces down there and look at the actual data and you see the truth. And yet the media doesn't report it. It's always the same hype. Oh, look, 200,000 jobs, blah, blah, blah. So, I don't know what to say. Is this, deliberate obfuscation? Is it just ignorance, laziness? I don't know. But that's just the jobs numbers. And there's plenty of problems with them. I mean, even the unemployment numbers are not accurate once you count all the people that have dropped out of the workforce. We've got a lower population labor wage earner ratio now than we did before lockdowns. So a lot of people just left. If a more accurate unemployment rate would be closer to 8%. But Natalie, if you want to talk about inflation,
Sure.
Let's talk about inflation. It just gets crazy. One of the things I've begun to do, because it really is. Do you believe the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or do you believe your own bank account? It's becoming kind of crazy. I just got curious about paper towels. This was just about an hour ago, and I decided to look at my own Amazon orders over the course of the last year, and I found some paper towels I bought last year, in 2023, a couple months earlier, before now. So it's about 16 months ago. And I calculated a 70% inflation rate. Okay. It's just crazy. And then, yesterday I went to go buy some olive oil, and I found that it had increased 100% from this time last year. And I'm looking at this stuff thinking there is something dreadfully wrong with the idea that we've had price increases of basically 20% over the last 3 years. I mean, that's just like, there's not a single one of your listeners or anybody who hears this who believes that prices are only up 20% in 3 years. It just can't be right. And so when you begin to look at the data, it turns out there's so many problems with the consumer price index that it's not even credible anymore. It excludes interest, it excludes taxes. It's got all these things called hedonic adjustments, which they magically find that the quality of everything is increasing, so therefore you have to adjust the increased prices for that. Without the hedonic adjustments, Shadow Stats finds the rates about twice as high as what they're reporting. But even things like home prices, rents, are calculated according to homeowners equivalent rent, which is this convoluted little scenario that just so happens to massively underreport the price of rents and houses. So that's not included either. And insurance, I mean, people are having to sell their homes because they can't even find affordable ways to insure them and sell them to, of course, cash buyers who don't need homeowners insurance. And that is not part of the consumer price index. And neither is car insurance, and neither, ironically, is an accurate measure of health insurance. According to the BLS, health insurance is up only 6% over 4 years. That is just not believable. And the way they do that is by calculating what you're paying for insurance against what the healthcare products you're consuming, which is a strange thing to do because you're paying that insurance whether you consume any or not. Anyway, you just march through all these things, and it starts just to look crazy. At 20%, I don't know. My friend and I, Peter St. Ange, we began to reflect on this a couple of days ago and look at it in detail, and we both calculated, if it is calculable at all, and it's not clear because there's a lot of things going on: shrinkflation, new additional fees, the fees that you're paying every turn. Those are not included in the consumer price index because there's no basket for them because they're brand new fees. We have service fees and processing fees and convenience fees and music fees, all kinds of fees. Those are not included in the index either. So once you start just speculating on this, you end up with figures that are closer to 35 and 50% overall increase in prices over the last 3 and 4 years. That is incredible. And it doesn't just affect the inflation data, which it does. It means that you're not getting raises that are even coming close to covering your increased costs. So that means real income is dramatically down, much larger than what they say. But when you consider other things like retail sales and wholesale factory orders, which they always report as like, they're up. Well, those data are never even adjusted for inflation. So if you can believe it, retail sales are always up, wholesale factory orders always up. But once you adjust them for inflation, they're dramatically down over 4 years. And then if you want to add to that a more accurate inflation statistics, and you can pick whatever you want. It's not 20% over 3 or 4 years. It's 35, 50% or more. Then you've got a very, very serious problem, retail sales and factory orders that make it look like this is a strong recessionary environment. And I feel like I need to let you interrupt me, but let me just add one more thing.
I could say, hold on, like Steve, but I'll let you get your last point in, and then I got a question for you.
Yeah, look, I've saved the most important point to the last. We have these things called national income accounting, which supposedly calculates productivity and the output, which we classify as GDP. Okay, the GDP numbers alone are massively skewed by the increase of government spending. When the government spends more, GDP goes up. All right, but even if you consider those, the relevant consideration is not nominal GDP, but real GDP. So adjust GDP by realistic inflation numbers. What do you end up with? Now, this, keep in mind, GDP is how we track the business cycle. Are we in recovery or are we in recession? Once you add to the GDP a realistic inflation number, it's very possible that we've lost as much as 13% of our GDP over the last 3 years. I mean, that I'm so sorry to say that. It means that we are right now in recession, maybe depression, maybe in an inflationary depression, the likes of which no living person has ever experienced. I'm sorry to report that to you. I know it sounds shocking. And I've run this by economists that are more competent than I am, and they all say the same thing. This sounds right. But it's not the consensus of the profession. It's not the consensus of the media. If I say that, people will think I'm crazy, so I'm not going to say it.
No, it's information warfare when it comes to the economy, and I think it's by design. And frankly, I think it's why War Room is so powerful, right? We actually cover these issues, and we don't treat the American people like, dumb grundoons, which is the way that the mainstream media talks to them in terms of giving them economic analysis. I think the cliche critique of, not teaching young Americans in high school how to do their taxes and anything related to fiscal policy, though it's cliche, it stands true, right? This is the same regime that's lying to us, saying that Ukraine aid packages are good for the United States economy because it's boosting the industrial base. It's just absolutely insane. And I think in a lot of your pieces, you draw to me what is the most important and interesting conclusion, which is that for an economy, for a business sector that is just hurtling towards, increased data and being able to understand consumers, why are we getting such horrible metrics on the economy? And that's my question for you, which again is similar to what I asked you about the COVID stuff and really just the ruling class in general. Is it a result of incompetence or intentional errors, intentional deception?
I think there's really three factors. I mean, one is that the data collection has been broken for a lot longer than I recognized. I used to believe everything that came out of the BLS or the Commerce Department or whatever. I never really questioned it. But the more you look into it, the more it just doesn't seem quite right. And by the way, in good economic times, you don't really care if the data's right. Just like, who cares? But when you feel your income declining, when you're suddenly, considering saving plastic containers from the store that you used to throw away, or you're reconsidering whether you can buy paper towels, you start to wonder, are they telling me the truth? So I've looked at the data collection. It's really weak. It's all left over from the New Deal. It's not really been upgraded, except in this weird hedonic adjustments, which is another weird question. So you've got that, and then you've got a deliberate obfuscation. There's no question about it. What's happening with the jobs numbers they're heavily manipulated. And they're pumping out these press releases, and what happens is the major media is very anxious to be the first one to report the new data, so they just adopt whatever is coming out of the BLS or the Commerce Department that day and run with it. 2 minutes after the data release, wow, where'd you get that story? Oh, well, we reprinted it from the agency. So you've got that, and you've got the Biden administration. I can't prove this, Natalie, but it just seems to me obvious that you've got the Biden administration heavily intervening now in these career bureaucrats and their messaging services, which then, as to the third point, that leads it to open political manipulation. We're going to see a lot of that between now and November. They're doing everything possible to paint a really pretty picture of the American economy as we approach November. At this point, there's really no reason to believe any of this stuff.
Jeffrey, we're coming up against the end of the show, so I got to let you go. I'll have you back on, but that's a nice segue to the next story we're going to cover here. But if people want to follow you, support Brownstone, where can they go to do all that?
Well, I post on X, Jeffrey A. Tucker, and Brownstone's also there. We have, a substantial number of followers, and you can also go to brownstone.org. And I really recommend people subscribe to the email list because it's, we're given today's censorship and everything. It's the only real way that we have to keep in contact with you. We only send one email a week, and it's just an accumulation of our articles and some thoughts of the day. But I really need to get that email list bolstered in light of everything that's happening these days. You got
to inflate the email list. We need some inflation on your email list numbers, or just pull a Biden and just say it's 1 million, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good one.
Appreciate it.
Speaking of political disruptions, a nice segue to the latest story that I just published on the warroom.org website, an exclusive DHS simulated war game prepping for plausible, that's a direct quote, nationwide droughts and blackouts. I'm sure you guys know CISA, right? The sort of outfit, the cutout of the Department of Homeland Security that has played not only a critical role in lying to us about the integrity of our elections, but it was revealed recently that they have sort of become the hotbed for allowing collusion between social media platforms and the government to censor basically all of the MAGA posse, or the MAGA audience, the War Room posse. And this story is really concerning. It should harken you guys back to Event 201, those of you who are familiar, these kind of war game scenarios that all of a sudden, a few years later, start to bear a striking resemblance to reality. And in this case, it was just July 1st, they uploaded documents to their website outlining war games that showed scenarios, and one of which was called Water Woes. The other one was described as Day Zero. In the first exercise, again, this is sponsored, put up by CISA, by the federal government, by Joe Biden. They basically tried to game out how they would deal with scenarios where there's just nationwide droughts and we have to duke it out for water. Water just goes away. It's a scarce resource that gets even scarcer, induced by, quote, demographic change, climate change, and even deadly pathogens being leaked into the water. Those are all direct quotes. And then the other scenario, compounded, and I think the real buried lead here is, despite they admit that they know that the transition to green energy is going to cause rolling blackouts and energy shortages, nevertheless, they persisted. They continue to push this, and they talk about, how they can kind of counter public distrust when it comes to energy shortages as a result of pursuing electric vehicles and other green energy policies. Like I said, I think we really need to take this seriously and look at this in the context of, like I said, that Event 201 style event where you see these, preventative exercises in just a few short years kind of becoming reality. And frankly, when you see Joe Biden, that candidacy just absolutely going to zero or negative, whatever it's already at, it's very clear that they're going to need to pull a fast one. They used COVID-19 last time. You already see bird flu talk reemerging. Who knows what they're going to do with the next election, but they know they can't win fair and square. That's why they lie through the media. But believe me, the media is complicit and will help them lie with whatever crises, polycrises as the WEF calls it, they want to roll out. I will be back. I will see you guys Monday, and I should be back in a regular studio back in Florida, so you guys can look forward to that. Have a wonderful weekend. Always good to see you guys.